Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's monthly roundup, Wildlife Wednesday monthly roundup for January 2021. I'm your host, Tenley Thompson, and we've got all the latest videos from the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem this week to show you, as well as some really awesome look at some of the plants and other animals, other features, geology, what have you as well. So let's go ahead and get started right away with an update on Grizzly Bear 399, who settled down for a long winter's nap. We got one last look at famous Grizzly Bear 399 and her 4 cubs as they made their way into their den this last week in Grand Teton National Park. Our naturalist Maddie got this amazing view of the fabulous 5 as they made their way into northern Grand Teton National Park up to their den site where they're now safely snuggled in for their long winter's torpor. Grizzly Bear 399 and all 4 of the cubs look incredibly round and fat and well prepared to sleep through some of the more difficult to find food seasons of Jackson Hole. So we wish them the best, and we'll keep you posted on when they emerge next spring. Pretty awesome stuff. We're really excited to see her all settled in with all 4 cubs, the first known grizzly bear to actually get to the den with 4 grizzly cubs. And a big thanks to Maddie, who's moderating our comment section tonight, for that great footage of Grizzly Bear 399. All right, next up, we've got a really interesting video that I will warn you has a little bit of gore involved. Let's check in with Laura to check out a carcass of a trumpeter swan killed by a coyote.
Hi everyone, this is Laura. Thank you for watching our Wildlife Wednesday. This week I want to highlight a video I filmed of a coyote hunting for a winter trumpeter swan. For some of our viewers, this might be difficult to watch. I totally understand, but as a naturalist, I want to highlight the relationship between a predator and its prey. And for a coyote, a trumpeter swan might be a really important meal in a long, hard Jackson Hole winter. Coyotes are omnivores, so they'll eat both plants and animals. I sometimes make up words. I call them opportunivores because they'll take the opportunity to eat whatever they can find. One of their favorite foods are rodents, such as mice, gophers, voles, or ground squirrels. They'll eat insects and grasshoppers. Sometimes they'll also hunt fawns, such as mule deer, white-tailed deer, or pronghorn fawns in the springtime. They'll eat eggs from ground nesting birds if those are available or accessible to the coyote. But in this case, our coyote targeted a young trumpeter swan, which we call a cygnet. Trumpeter swans are North America's largest waterfowl. An adult trumpeter can be up to 6 feet long and can weigh between 20 to 30 pounds. I think the swan that was targeted by the coyote in my video was a youngster or a cygnet. I could tell because his feathers were a grayish white color instead of the bleach white feathers of an adult. Trumpeter swans in the winter usually congregate around areas with holes in the ice where they can still tip their butts in the air and eat aquatic plants off of the bottom. A group of swans is known as a ballet, a regatta, or a drift of swans. Those are all really cool names. But our coyote was quite bold in descending down onto thin ice to a place where he could grab a cygnet off the water. Of course, swans can be extremely defensive, just like Canada geese. They'll hiss, They'll bite, they'll flap their big 10-foot wings, or even scratch at a predator to defend themselves or their young. They did put up quite a fight, but that coyote was too fast, too swift. He was able to snag a cygnet and make off with it. As you can see in my video, the snow was quite deep. The coyote had a hard time hopping through deep snow, carrying a heavy trumpeter swan. But for the coyote, this might have meant life or death. This might have been his only meal this week. So he was able to carry that trumpeter swan off into the forest and have a nice winter time meal. So thank you for watching.
So thanks, Laura, for that pretty fascinating look into the lives of both coyotes and trumpeter swans. So where's everybody joining us from? Let me know in the comment section. I'd love to see it. And tell me a little bit more about what you'd like to see in our new and improved Wildlife Wednesday monthly roundups. We're going to be doing these the first Wednesday of each month, 5:30 Mountain Time on Facebook Live instead of the weekly broadcast that we were doing in 2020. That way we can bring you the very best of the month in a short and sweet hour that you're going to really, really enjoy. Next, let's check in with our area moose. Winter is always such a great time to see and view moose in Grand Teton National Park. We've got a great number of them that make their way out into the open sagebrush flats and meadows to feed and make their way through winter. Antelope bitterbrush, which this moose can be seen eating here, is an incredibly important food source for moose this time of year that grows almost exclusively in and amongst sagebrush plateaus. And so you can see why moose might move up from river bottom areas or down from more mountainous areas with deeper snow to make their way out into the sagebrush flats where it's much, much easier to survive. We even have moose that make their way into the town of Jackson because most landscaping is non-native. A lot of plants that come from Europe and Asia don't have the bitter chemicals or tannins that our native plants have, and so are much more palatable to moose. It's pretty clever, actually, to come down into the town and just eat everyone's landscaping. Laura got this great view of these 3 bull moose out in Grand Teton National Park on the sagebrush flats, just playfully sparring with each other. My favorite is the one with just the single antler. It's already shed the antler on one side. Since this video was taken, we've seen several more moose lose their antlers for the season. Now they'll start to grow back this summer, but for now they'll be antlerless throughout the winter. Moose as a species are typically solitary, but because antelope bitterbrush grows pretty densely in patches, it's not uncommon for us in the winter to see a group of moose together. And it's not that they're acting in a herd capacity or using each other for protection, it's more that they're all clustered into these areas. And why not, while you're clustered feeding, have a little bit of fun sparring while you're at it? Now, moose are one of the species that's perhaps best adapted to winter in Jackson Hole. They have long, strong legs and hooves that are perfect for deep snow conditions, and they're well built and insulated for our cold conditions. In fact, when it snows here, it's not uncommon to see snow build up on their backs over time because moose are so well insulated that no heat is escaping their bodies. Every animal has an optimum temperature range where they lose the fewest calories trying to either stay warm or stay cool. In humans, that temperature range is usually in the 70 to 80 degree Fahrenheit range. That's when we're most comfortable and we use the least amount of energy keeping ourselves warm or cool. For moose, it's actually below freezing. They're most comfortable this time of year, and these are the conditions that they're most adapted to survive in. Sometimes my guests on trips might feel sorry for moose while they're out there in the winter and say, oh, it must be so difficult for them because it's so cold for me. But please don't feel sorry for our moose. They are so much happier right now in these temperature conditions than they ever would be in the summer. In fact, anytime it gets above 70 degree Fahrenheit In the valley, moose can be at risk of heat exhaustion in the summer. So it's a really nice situation for them to be out roaming in these nice, cool, comfortable conditions. This moose still has a full set of antlers, but not for long. Pretty soon, just like this moose, he'll have shed his antlers, and just that antler scar on the head will remain. You can see that this moose has so recently shed their antlers that that scar is a little bit bloody. Now, there's some question on whether or not losing antlers is painful or not for moose, but there's no question that it's probably quite itchy. It's not uncommon to see moose this time of year rubbing their heads up against trees or other objects in an attempt to get the antlers off more quickly. If it is painful to lose antlers, scientists believe it's probably more akin to losing a tooth or shedding a scab, and not something that's truly painful. And of course, let's not neglect the mothers and calves that are out on the landscape too. This little calf is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, how the snow just doesn't melt off their backs. They're so well insulated. It's learning to forage on antelope bitterbrush under its mother's tutelage, and doing really well for it too. Moose calves are going to spend 2 years with their mothers before they're out on their own, learning all the things they need to know in order to be strong, healthy adult moose. So if you find yourself in Jackson Hole in winter, I encourage you to travel out in the sagebrush flats and cottonwoods of Jackson Hole to go and find a moose. You never quite know where they're going to be. The other day I was snowshoeing along the river and quite surprised myself when a moose appeared apparently out of nowhere. They were so covered in snow from a recent snowstorm and so comfortable that they appeared white like everything else around them. Luckily, I was able to move out of the area in plenty of time and not disturb the moose. So a big thanks to Laura and Tyler for all this great footage of moose over the last week or so. For EcoTour Adventures, this is Naturalist Tenley signing off. Super fun footage, and a big thanks to Tyler and Laura for all those great views of moose. Now, as the snow gets deeper and we've had a couple crazy powder days over the last couple days here in Jackson Hole, we'll see more and more moose actually make their way into the town of Jackson and even onto the ski hills of the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort. It's pretty fun to see them wandering around town, but we do want to remind everybody to definitely give them as much distance as you can. Every year, obviously, there's some interactions for the moose that can be pretty harmful for them. Anytime they have to run away from barking dogs or other sort of nuisances of humans, they're going to use up some of that critical body fat that they need to survive the winter. All right. Enough preaching. Next up, we've got this really fascinating video from Sarah Ernst. I've been bugging her for a little while to just show us some of the things she sees when she takes guests out on a cross-country ski trip, and some of the more fascinating aspects of winter ecology that aren't big charismatic megafauna like grizzly bears, wolves, or moose. So let's check in about all the little things to enjoy on a cross-country ski trip with Sarah Ernst.
Hello, this is Guide Sarah Ernst, and we're here today to talk about some of the mysterious fluffy stuff that's growing on the branches of the firs and the spruces and the pines that we often see along our cross-country ski and snowshoe trails. Let's go take a closer look. I know many of our viewers are from the South, and I used to guide out in South Carolina, and one of my favorite things about the beauty of that place was the Spanish moss hanging down from the tree branches. And this organism right here does resemble all that Spanish moss. Spanish moss, while it bears a resemblance to these organisms, is an air plant, an epiphyte in the bromeliad family. That makes it a relative of the common pineapple. And it grows on tree branches and just uses them as a place to perch. It's not hurting the trees that it grows on. These organisms here are also just using the branches as a place to perch. As you can see, it's actually a dead tree. So there's no nutrients for these to tap because the wood is now dead. Let's take a closer look. This organism is not a plant at all, even though it's green and it is doing photosynthesis. In fact, when I say it's an organism, it's actually two organisms taken a liken to one another. we have the structure provided by a fungus, and the photosynthesis is done by an algae living within the fungus. The fungus provides a home for the algae, and any extra sugars produced by the algae is absorbed by the fungus. So it's a mutual beneficial relationship between two different kingdoms of organisms. Many lichens are indicator species of air pollution. They're very sensitive to air pollution, and this one is no exception. This is Usnea, or one of my very favorite names, common names for this plant, is Old Man's Beard. You can imagine a mountain man stumbling out of the woods up here, having not washed his beard in a couple of years, and it kind of getting this green. This Douglas fir is absolutely covered at the base by the third type of lichen we commonly see in the winter. A little hard to get to though from down here, so let's see if I can find one that's easier to get to. Alright, I had to ski a little further to find some of our next example of the lichen that grows here. This is Bryoria, also known locally as horsehair lichen, because it does kind of resemble some long, kind of slightly unkempt horse's mane or tail hanging down out of the trees. Out of all the lichens we see here in the wintertime, this one is the most edible, although not all species are, but there are some species in this genus that are edible for humans. It's hard for humans to digest the carbohydrates out of this, so it's not a major food source. It's what we call edible, but not necessarily that eatable in large quantities. But one of the animals that does make use of this organism in the wintertime is the flying squirrel, the northern flying squirrel. Flying squirrels, like the red or pine squirrels that we see in the forests around here, do not hibernate. And unlike us humans, they are able to digest this lichen a little bit easier. Flying squirrels and birds can also use this soft horsehair lichen to line their nests when they're making nests. When you hike by these flowers in the summer, they look brown, but if you look carefully, there's actually dozens of little yellow flowers that bloom from each little socket you see here, where the seeds have fallen out now in winter. There are still some seeds left here though, and they may blow away in the wind on a nice wintry, windy day, or they may be picked up by some of our seed-eating songbirds that do winter here, like the pine siskin. Two different types of plants that we sometimes see sticking out of the snow, even when it's quite deep out. And the first is this plant behind me. What we're seeing are the old seed heads that have since released their seeds and sent them out into the environment. These are the tops of a plant called cow parsnip. Cow parsnip is the largest member of the carrot and parsley family that we see here in the Jackson Hole ecosystem. And it grows pretty commonly, especially in moist habitats. It's an important food source for several wild animals, especially for bears. And it is mildly toxic to humans, though the young shoots were traditionally used as a source of food for Native Americans. But it is mildly toxic, and it bears a resemblance to one of the most toxic plants in the world, water hemlock. So you don't want to go around trying to sample cow parsnip here in the spring. You can see some of the seeds still attached to the seed heads here, and the seed head forms a shape kind of like if you were holding out your umbrella in a strong wind and it got blown inside out. This is called the umbel and is common to this family of plants. Right behind me is a fir that has been pretty heavily browsed on by moose, most likely, and growing on it is one of the only native vines to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This is one of our clematis vines. Take a look at that. Isn't that beautiful? They kind of remind me of a hairdo that would be worn by one of the Muppets from Jim Henson. These are the seed heads for the clematis vine, and they grow in many species across much of North America. They also are cultivated for their beautiful flowers. Here, this species of clematis is blue flowered with a pale interior, and a lovely little resident of these darker fir forests that we're in right now. All right, so most of the wolf lichen I found on my ski is at the base of the big, beautiful Doug firs that grow here. Whoa! But I'm going to cheat a little bit. We're going to talk about this little wolf lichen that's growing on this old tree stump. This neon green beauty is Litharia vulpina. And if you know your Latin, vulpin is from fox, not wolf. But locally we know it as wolf lichen, and it gets its name in both cases from vulpinic acid, which is a toxic acid, produces a byproduct by the lichen, and it is used by the lichen to kind of ward off herbivores that might want to eat it. It's pretty toxic, and old ranchers would use powdered wolf lichen to poison predators. So foxes, coyotes, wolves. In Latin it's fox, and in English it's wolf lichen. But this could be used just powdered to poison meat, or to make it even worse, ground glass. Luckily for the foxes and for the lichen, that's not done very much anymore. The same acid is very useful as a natural dye, used to, despite the bright green look that it has right here, it gives the fabric that you're dyeing more of a yellow cast than anything else. So beautiful to look at, but not one you want to taste. Okay, this is the last of the seed heads that I'm going to show you. It's peeking up over the snow, grows pretty abundantly here, and boy, I sure wish that I couldn't find any today to show you, because this is an invasive species. It's one of 3 that we see here. This one is musk thistle. Musk thistle forms dark purple flowers at the end of summer and through early fall. And it's very popular amongst pollinators. So as a certified bug nerd, I kind of feel guilty for picking the flower heads when I see them, because the pollinators do love them. And the little mice and songbirds of our meadows also love feeding on the seed heads. So ecologically, they do have some use in the ecosystem, but unfortunately they will multiply and form thickets that are impenetrable to other wildflowers. So we don't really like seeing this here, and I've tried to pick as many as I could from this trail, but there's just so many. There are native thistles to this region, including elk thistle, which is an important food source for Native Americans and early trappers and settlers out here. This one I wish we did not find on this ski. So those are a few seed heads to keep an eye out for as you're recreating here in the backcountry of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If you see any when you're out here that we haven't gone over, feel free to take a picture of it and send it to us. We'd be thrilled to identify it for you. All right behind me in this little tree, I saw something that looks like it might belong into club lichen, but it's actually a completely different organism. I kind of had to fall in the snow to get a nice close-up shot of it for you. So here we have this organism on the trunk of this young lodgepole pine tree. And unlike the organisms we've been looking at, the lichens we've been looking at so far, which were pretty easy to tug off, these seem to be deeply rooted into the trunk of the tree. And that's exactly what it is. It's tapped into the xylem and phloem layers of this young pine tree. So unlike the lichens, which are not harming the trees that they're sitting on, this is a parasite, and one that we kind of know a lot about in pop culture, kissing under the mistletoe, but we don't see a lot of examples of mistletoe in our daily lives. This is a dwarf mistletoe, and one of the reasons why mistletoe became famous for the holidays is because it tends to have brightly colored berries, attracting birds that will eat them. And then when the bird poops out the seed, it's a bit of a sticky seed, and it will stick onto the branches of the tree that the bird is pooping on, and then start its life cycle over again. Dwarf mistletoe, though, does not have berries that are spread by birds. Instead, these seeds are spring-loaded once they reach maturity, and they'll shoot out dozens of feet through the air to land on, hopefully, the branches of other pine trees around here. Now, of course, most of them don't land on a branch, but they are sticky, and if they do land onto the tree trunk or onto a branch, they can then start to tap into the tree. Mistletoe does not usually harm the tree that it's growing on in normal situations. Often when we see a tree that's absolutely covered in dwarf mistletoe, there's something else wrong with it that's making it particularly vulnerable. So this little lodgepole has a long way to go before it hits the towering pines and firs around it, but it does have a very good chance. And with one last look at the giant hole that we made to get you an up-close and personal look at dwarf mistletoe, this is Guide Sarah Ernst signing off.
So, who thought that they'd tune in to Wildlife Wednesday tonight and learn all about lichen and mistletoe? And who learned something new about mistletoe tonight? Sarah Ernst is one of the most amazing grizzly and wolf finders I've ever met and seen, but she is a great example of the consummate naturalist, which is to say, no matter how big or small, everything in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem is a marvel and a wonder. And it's just a delight to spend a day in the woods with her. And I definitely recommend anybody who wants to learn about anything large or small, definitely come out and take a trip with her. We definitely take requests, and Sarah Ernst is definitely one of the most fun ones out there. I have to tell you, it reminds me of a time when I was waiting for a grizzly bear to come over the top of a ridge. I'd seen him go up the side of one side of the mountain. I went around the mountain and I was waiting for him to come back down this ridge, and I was just sitting there waiting, and I realized I was sitting in the middle of an ant battle. After a couple minutes, I realized there was just a fury going on, and one colony was in an all-out battle against the other colony, and it was the most amazing thing. The battle took place in waves, and the front moved, and different battalions came out, and it was fascinating to watch. So fascinating that the grizzly bear finally came over the ridge, and I was not nearly as interested in that as I was in this ongoing ant battle. I ended up staying there for another couple hours just to see who won. It was one of the more fun things. So you gotta remember the little things in life as well as those big charismatic megafauna. All right, so those are the videos we've got for you guys this week. Super duper fun. And now it's time for my second favorite part of the program, which of course is our trivia question of the week. So we started our Eco Tour Adventures online store during the COVID closure as a way to support our employees. And it's still available to this day. Maddie will go ahead and put a link up in the comment section, but we definitely want to tell you about the featured item of the week. And remember, the winner of the trivia question is going to get a $10 gift card towards our Eco Tour Adventures store, and they could certainly put it towards something like this. And the item of the week is Elk River. It's a photographic print or framed print by our naturalist Josh Metton, taken on the National Elk Refuge, and it is one of the more stunning images, particularly in kind of a white room, that I've ever seen. He has it offered as a metal print, as a photographic print that you can frame yourself, but definitely if you want to support the guides who make this broadcast, the naturalists that you see every week, consider checking out our online store. There's a lot of super fun stuff, amazing art, things made by guides, other local artists, photographic prints, paintings, awesome steel-ware, definitely worth checking out. And of course, if you are enjoying our broadcast, you can always give us a tip. 100% of the proceeds of the store go to our guides and staff, but if you want to drop us $5 because you're enjoying things, we're certainly not going to object to that. Our Wildlife Monthly broadcast is here for everyone to enjoy regardless, but we definitely want to let you know about the store and let you know that if you want some Eco Tour Adventures swag, that's a great way to get some. All right, so our trivia question last week came from Eco Tour's naturalist Laura, who you saw earlier talking about the coyote going after the trumpeter swan. She's also here in the comments section. She shot this video, and the question we had is, name the animal depicted in the video. Now, this is last week's question, so we've already awarded a winner. But if you think that you know the answer, go ahead and tell us in the comments section. I'm going to warn you, I had to slow this video down because this animal moves so fast. Okay, what is this animal? What's its name? See it hiding in the bushes there? Laura actually filmed this as she was skiing at the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort up high on the mountain. So do you know what the name of that animal? The key features is you're looking at an all white animal with a black tip on its tail. And I'll go ahead and give you guys a hint. It's actually an animal that we featured in our trivia before as an animal that changes color from winter to summer. So the answer, we accepted two different things because there's two different names people use for this animal. In fact, there's a European variation, which I'm not going to accept in this case because it's, and I'll tell you what it is, but it's not what we technically call them in North America. But the correct answers I would have accepted was, of course, ermine, or short-tailed weasel. So if you answered either one of those last week, then you were entered in a chance to win that gift card. Our naturalist Elise has gone ahead and informed the winner. Now, I'll tell you guys, because a couple people did say this, we did not accept stoat. And a stoat is a variation of weasel that lives in Europe. And stoats are also sometimes called ermine, and they're sometimes called short-tailed weasels, but they're not exactly the same. So we didn't accept stoat, but we did accept ermine or short-tailed weasel. Now, we're famous here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem for the number of weasels we have, and we've done this before, but who can name me all the species of weasel in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? It's pretty surprising how many of them we have, and remember, not all of them are tiny like an ermine. Some of them are quite large. So if you know any of the other members of our weasel family, I think the last time we did this, we decided there were 7. I think I originally said there were 5, and I was forgetting about 2 very, very rare ones that we don't see very often. So see if you can get them all, and Maddie will go ahead and post all of them in the comment section maybe towards the end of the broadcast. Okay, so that was last week's question. This week's question I thought would be super fun to go back to geography. We haven't asked a geography-based question in a while, and everybody seems to enjoy those. So originally I was going to ask you to name me any peak in the Teton Range other than the Grand Teton, but I decided we got to make this a little harder. So the question officially is, name me any of the major peaks in the Teton Range except the Grand Teton and Mount Moran. Neither one of those qualify because we got to make it a little bit harder. And here's the way this is going to work. For every peak you name, you're going to get an entry. So if you can name me 15 major peaks of the Teton Range, we'll give you 15 entries into the $10 gift card. If you can name me 1 peak in the Teton Range, then you get 1 entry into the gift card. Now, if you really want to impress me, when I was 12 and I was in summer camp in Jackson Hole, I was required to learn all of the peaks from the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort all the way to the northern boundary of Grand Teton National Park. So basically the full main range from south to north. My big challenge to you, and this challenge goes double if you're one of our EcoTour Adventures guides who's watching tonight, can you name me all of the major peaks from the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort all the way to the northern boundary? Now, that's just bonus points. You'll definitely get an entry for every peak you name, but I'd be very, very impressed to see if anybody can pull that off. And no Googling. That's cheating. Don't Google. And no copying other people's answers. Come on, guys. And if you've never been to Jackson Hole or the Jackson Hole region, we do recognize that this is a more tough one to answer. But hopefully you'll learn a couple things along the way, and some of these peaks have fascinating histories in terms of their names and why they're called what they are. So, okay, before I give anything more away, because the more I talk about this, the more I'm going to slip one of the names of the peaks, let's go ahead and let you guys do that. And it's time for my favorite part of Wildlife Wednesday, which is I'm here to answer your questions as a biologist live. So if you have a question that's wildlife biology related, geology, history, just the natural world related, definitely let me know in the comment section. I'm going to see if I can't get you all an answer. Now, I will warn you, I'm looking at my iPad here, so you may see me looking down so I can see all of the questions. So bear with me because I may have to read through a few, but we'll see if we can't get you guys some answers. Let's see here. All right. Oh, I love this. Debbie says, it was so great to see Sarah Ernst. I've been on many tours with her when visiting the area. She's amazing, isn't she? She is one of the consummate naturalists that I've ever met in my life. She's an absolute treasure and just so much fun. And whoever thought you could make lichens super duper interesting, Sarah Ernst can make lichens super duper interesting. So thanks so much for tuning in. Oh, I love Maddie's response. She's amazing, right? That's correct. That's what I just said. All right, let's see here. All right, I'm going to start from the top here. Talking about those trumpeter swans that Laura took that amazing footage of. Bethany asks, was that one of the newly imported cygnets to Yellowstone? Remember, a cygnet, of course, is a juvenile or chick trumpeter swan. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with learning what groups of animals were called and what males and female animals were called and what the young versus the adults were. And one of my favorites is cygnets. A cygnet is a young swan, and that's why they're kind of grayish in color. You can kind of tell the difference. That was not one of the Yellowstone cygnets. So for those of you guys who aren't terribly familiar with trumpeter swans, they were in pretty perilous shape in the late 1970s, early 1980s, definitely on the endangered species list, pretty close to extinction, and they are one of only 2 swan species native to North America, the other, of course, being the tundra swan, and so it really would have been a travesty to lose them. I'm sure you guys have all seen swans in America before, but they've got those yellow-orange beaks, right? Those are mute swans that come out of Europe. They're not native to the United States. Trumpeter swans are our national native swan, and so we didn't want to lose them. When I was a little girl, the Wyoming Wetlands Society started raising swans in captivity to try and release the young into areas traditionally in the western United States where they lived. Basically, trumpeter swans suffered from kind of a triple whammy. The first was the hunting of swans for their feathers for ladies' hats, which was big business from about 1880 all the way to 1930. And of course, those beautiful white feathers were much sought after by folks who were building hats all over Europe and the United States, and they were almost driven to extinction along with many other beautiful birds in the United States, which is actually the start of the National Refuge System, of which the National Elk Refuge is part of. The second thing that happened to them was the great draining of the wetlands that occurred in the 1950s into the 1960s. We had this massive agricultural revolution in the United States. We started to really grow huge quantities of crops, and we became the breadbasket of the Western Hemisphere. We were able to feed the world on our corn, but at the price of draining many of our wetlands that a lot of our waterfowl rely on. And so a lot of our waterfowl species really suffered as a result of that, which is when we see the great expansion of the refuge system in the United States by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And trumpeter swans were definitely victim to that. And then lastly, trumpeter swans have never been overly numerous to begin with. And so they weren't really able to recover from these big shocks that happened to them as a population. The Wyoming Wetlands Society went ahead and raised some swans here in Jackson Hole and released them back into areas like Yellowstone, into Montana, Idaho, and other areas of the United States. The swans down here in Jackson Hole on the National Elk Refuge on Flat Creek, they recovered the quickest and their population has remained the most stable. This particular cygnet came out of that Flat Creek population. So that particular swan came from a population of swans that are doing relatively well. Now, swans were removed from the endangered species list. They've been doing really well. And recently in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, their population is crashing yet again. The only real viable population we have left is that same Flat Creek Creek population where that coyote took that signet. So on the one hand, it's great that we didn't lose another swan out of the Yellowstone population. There are so few swans left in Yellowstone that it's likely we're going to have to do some reintroductions there in the future, although we'll see as time goes on. But the Flat Creek population is doing okay. They are stable. That's where that signet was taken from. So thanks very much for that question. Let's see here. Don says, oh, in terms of ideas of things we could do for the show, he says you could take us on a tour. Show us our van and equipment we provide. We do have really amazing vans with these roof hatches and big burly vehicles, 4x4s. Maybe one day we'll do that. We definitely aren't here to advertise at you. We just want you to enjoy the wildlife of the Great Yellowstone ecosystem, but you might find our van super duper fun. So perhaps we'll do that. That's a great idea. Karen asks, how long does it take for moose to regrow their antlers? Karen, that's a great question. So moose typically shed their antlers in January or February, sometimes as late as March, and then they begin to regrow them almost immediately, as soon as they can get into the fresh green growth of the new year. And they continue to grow those antlers until they get to the rut of the fall. So a full set of antlers is going to take roughly from about April into September, basically would be the sort of short answer to that. About an inch of bone a day that they're growing. So pretty incredible stuff. Some of the fastest growing bone in the world, along with elk antler. So thanks very much for that. Bill, you ask a really interesting question. Is the general public allowed to take moose antlers? Bill, it depends on where you are. So that video was taken in Grand Teton National Park, where the removal of any resources in any national park is prohibited. Now, there's a very simple reason for that. And the first one is that the Park Service doesn't want to pick and choose in terms of what people are allowed to take and what they're not allowed to take. They want to keep it pretty simple. But the second reason is because antlers are a very important natural resource. It's one of the only sources of calcium in the natural world in Jackson Hole, which is pretty critical, particularly for rodent populations and small mammals, in terms of getting enough calcium by gnawing on those antlers that are shed out in Antelope Flats and some of these other areas in Grand Teton National Park. So definitely can't remove any antlers, but there are other places where it is legal to do so. Most of Jackson Hole is under a wildlife closure. Most of western Wyoming is under a winter wildlife closure, which is to say we don't want you to go into critical habitats outside the national parks that animals need to survive in the winter. But the Bridger Teton National Forest does allow folks to go out into the forest after May 1st and remove antlers. There's some regulations involved with that. I definitely recommend you check out the Bridger Teton National Forest's website that goes all into this, but hunting antler, or hunting sheds as it's known, is big business in Wyoming and other states. We are home to the largest elk herd in the world, so it's not just moose paddles that people are after, and we have hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who come out to get sheds and antlers every year on public lands that are not protected from resource removal. So something you want to do, you want to come out and get sheds, I definitely recommend you give it a try. The Grand Shed Hunt is just fun to be part of. Once we're all vaccinated, I think it'll be more of a grand adventure for sure. But it's really hard. It's really, really hard. However, I do have a few friends in Jackson Hole who a number of years ago went out with some pack mules. They spent 2.5 weeks out in the backcountry, piled antlers high on those 2 pack mules, came out of the front country, and were able to sell those antlers. We also have the world's largest elk antler auction here as well in Jackson Hole. They were able to sell those antlers, and they didn't have to work the rest of the year. Antlers, very, very valuable. Traditionally, we're going to see rates between $17 to $28 a pound for a good elk antler. Moose antler, which is much more rare, is going to go for a much higher rate than that. Folks, of course, are now asking me, what are people doing with all this antler? Why is it so valuable? There's a variety of different things that are done with antler. A growing use, of course, is dog chews. A lot of people like to give their dogs antler, and the veterinary technician in me does have to state, be careful with elk antler chews. They're great for dogs for sure. They certainly clean their teeth, but don't allow them to get so absorbed with them that they can crack their teeth, or you're going to have a big dental bill. I definitely encourage folks to give their dogs antlers, but not like the kind of dogs who just gnaw really, really hard obsessively on something. They can definitely hurt their teeth. So keep that in mind. But regardless, dog chews are one market. There's a great number of antlers that are sold to Asian markets for herbal cures, traditional medicines, and the like. And then, of course, chandeliers and furniture and carvings and all those things are certainly, antlers are used for that as well. So great question. Thanks very much for that. Let's see here. Don, this is a fascinating one. I read in the Jackson Hole News and Guide, that's our local newspaper, about how lion numbers fall when wolf numbers rise. How do wolves catch kittens? Do they dig them out? Catch them in the open? These are really, really good questions. I'm so glad you asked. So one of the more fascinating, unexpected consequences of wolf reintroduction to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem was that it was hard on our mountain lion population, but only in certain areas. Mountain lions aren't necessarily getting preyed upon by wolves everywhere. There are very specific areas where we are seeing increased predation from wolves, particularly on young mountain lions. So really, really interesting stuff. There's a bunch of things that were totally unexpected about adding wolves back into the ecosystem. For those of you guys who are not familiar with this issue, wolves were expatriated. They were made extinct in the United States by the late 1920s, and they were reintroduced by the federal government into Yellowstone National Park in 1995, and then they gradually expanded their range into the western United States. At the same time that that was happening, and we began to see wolves in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, wolves began to naturally return to Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and then later on, quite a few years later, we began to see wolves coming into places like Oregon, Washington, and then even into California. Now we're beginning to see occasionally wolves in Colorado, which went ahead and just voted in the last election to have a reintroduction program there. So we're slowly seeing the return of the wolf to the United States. And the thing to remember about wolves is it's a very controversial subject. People either love wolves or they hate wolves, and they're very, very polarized. I don't know any other topics in the United States that people are very, very polarized, but the truth is oftentimes in the middle. And that particularly seems to happen in wildlife biology, where there are good things and bad things about any animal. There's good things and bad things about bald eagles. There's good things and bad things about elk. There's good things and bad things about grizzly bears. There's good things and bad things about wolves. And most of the things that people are frightened about when it comes to wolves, just most of those are myths. They're simply not true. There are certainly things about wolves that can be problematic to humans and human economy. And there's certainly things about wolves that can be problematic to certain species. But the vast majority of the idea is that, wolves attack people. They don't. Wolves are going to kill all the elk. Elk populations have grown every year since they were introduced. Those sorts of things that you commonly hear, those are less true. Wolves absolutely can prey on cattle. They just don't do it very often. It's pretty rare. You're going to see far more predation from something like a grizzly bear or a mountain lion than you're going to see from a wolf. So at the end of the day, one of the things we didn't expect, we expected all those sorts of concerns, is their impact on mountain lions. Mountain lions, we don't know exactly what's going on there because we're not exactly witnessing wolves going after these lions, but almost certainly there has to be some degree of sneaking up an ambush involved, because a mountain lion's first instinct when it feels like it's endangered, particularly kittens, is to get up into a tree. And so wolves are probably chasing them down, chasing them away, using pack behavior to try to keep them from escaping, and then going ahead and preying upon them at that point. Why wolves do this? Hard to say, but of course, wolves will also kill coyotes when they get the opportunity because they compete with them for food resources and for particularly carcasses. And so that certainly could be an issue for sure. Wolves will go after grizzly cubs when they get the opportunity. Same issue, right? So it's probably likely the same thing. Predators not wanting to compete with predators. But our mountain lion population is doing just fine. In fact, we've got one of the more stable mountain lion populations in the United States. So while wolves are preying on more mountain lions, it's not causing them to suddenly go downhill or we're going to lose mountain lions. It is making us have to be more thoughtful when it comes to hunting of mountain lions by humans, and we definitely need to pay a little bit more attention to the impact that we're having on mountain lion populations if we're seeing other impacts as well, and we need to balance out those needs. So hopefully that answers your question. Oh, this is a great one. Sadie says, Laura mentioned that the lichen, actually it was Sarah, are impacted by pollution. Has the airport traffic altered the flora? That's a great question. There's been a ton of studies that have been done on how the airport that's located inside Grand Teton National Park, the only airport in a national park in the country, impacts all aspects of Grand Teton National Park. And the results are sometimes surprising and sometimes predictable. We haven't really looked that hard into how it impacts the lichen. So the short answer is, I don't necessarily know, but I will tell you that we've certainly done a lot of testing of air quality from the airport. And that's of much less concern than, for instance, noise pollution affecting wildlife. There is definitely some air pollution that is definitely being caused by those planes, but they're actually, they have certain restrictions in place to try to keep that air pollution at a minimum. Other things that sometimes come up in the politics of the airport, de-icing planes, right? We don't want that de-icing liquid to get into the groundwater. And there's been a little bit of concern and some cases where it has gotten into the groundwater. So I'm not aware of any air pollution effect on plants and lichen and fungi, but we'll definitely check in with Sarah, who might know more than I do on that particular topic. It also just might not have been studied, but there are some other concerns: air pollution, sound pollution, and of course, groundwater pollution. I will say that the airport is very cognizant of all these things. They don't have a choice. They have to be very careful. A lot of environmental impact studies have been done and continue to be done about the airport maintaining its operation in Grand Teton, and that permission to operate in the park does have to be renewed. And so there's been a lot of time and effort looked at when it comes to the airport and some of these concerns. And a lot of these concerns are pretty heavily mitigated. They've spent millions of dollars trying to protect the groundwater, for instance. So definitely a good question. Big politics here in Jackson Hole. All right, let's see here. Oh man, lots of mountain peaks. You guys are doing good. All right, let's see here. Oh, this is a fascinating question. If a bear asks, Ingrid asks, if a bear eats a gut pile from an elk that is CWD, will it affect the bear or grizzly? The short answer? If you eat from an elk that's infected with CWD, will it affect you? The short answer is if you ingest nervous tissue from an animal who is affected with the prion disorder that CWD, chronic wasting disease is what that means, mad cow disease, scrappy, Creutzfeldt-Jacobson's disease, or Jacobson's, I'm not sure which one that is. If you eat the nervous tissue from any of those animals that are affected with those diseases, then there is a possibility that you can acquire the disease. But it's not very well understood because, of course, it's fatal. It's not a good thing for humans to ingest. It's not a good thing for bears to ingest. The assumption is if a human were to eat nervous system tissue, so spinal cord tissue, brain tissue, the like, that we could get a prion disorder that's like CWD or the human variant, the Creutzfeldt-Jacobson, much like eating mad cow nervous system tissue. There's absolutely no reason to think a grizzly bear would not be affected in exactly the same way, or any other animal that was affected that way. And it is for that reason that Grand Teton National Park actually changed the way that they manage roadkill in the park this year. So historically, they have moved animals who were hit by cars to a remote location. Grizzlies would occasionally feed at that location. They knew it was there. They don't want the grizzlies to be affected by CWD, and so they went ahead and made that food resource unavailable to grizzlies. And there are some theories that that's one of the reasons that Grizzly Bear 399 actually made her way south in early winter, because she didn't have that as a traditional food resource, nor did some of these other grizzlies. So I assure you that everybody's thinking real hard about that right now. And the short answer is, yeah, anything that eats an elk affected with CWD potentially could get a fatal disease from it. So the less CWD infected elk that we have, or moose or deer, the better off we are. And taking what measures we can to try to stop the spread of that disease in Jackson Hole, but throughout the western United States, is a pretty important thing in wildlife ecology, wildlife biology, wildlife management out there. So great question. Let's see here. Oh, great. Do humans use the lichen that Sarah shared for any use or purpose? So Sarah talked a little bit about some of the purposes that we've traditionally used lichen for. Everything from an a deadly agent to kill wolves, a poison, to even a really not very good food resource. You'd have to be pretty desperate to try and eat them. We also, of course, use them decoratively. I'm sure everybody has seen things like reindeer moss in plants and the like, and terrariums and what have you. Traditionally, native peoples certainly ate some of these food resources, and they're incredibly important for a lot of different wildlife. So yes, we've been using all sorts of fungi and lichen across different peoples of the world for millennia. But you do have to be careful. Some of them are poisonous, some of them are not good to ingest, and some of them absolutely are. And then the last thing you might have heard Sarah mention is they can make good dye stuffs. So if you were to take fabric and you were to mix some of these lichens in and boil them together, you can get some really interesting, fun, natural dyes and colors out of them as well. So great question. Let's see here. Beth says, may we have an update on the CWD situation amongst the elk on the refuge? Beth, I don't have one. We haven't found another case. When they do have a case, there'll be probably a press release from whatever federal agency it was found on. It's inevitable we'll probably find another one. I've been saying it's inevitable we'll find it in Jackson Hole for the last 10 years, right? Because we've been finding it as close as 40 miles from here in places like on a Moose and Star Valley and the like. So we will see more cases. Those will be announced as we see them, but it's critically important that we test. A very small minority of the animals in the ecosystem are being tested. Now remember, CWD is something that we're only going to see in the deer family, so white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose are going to be susceptible to that disease. We're not seeing any cases of scrappy, for instance, in sheep, so we're not worried about that yet, although it's maybe the same disease. There's some debate on whether these are all just one disease or whether they're separate variations of the same prion abnormally folded protein disorder. But when we got an update, we can absolutely give you guys one. It could be a long time. It could be a short period of time. But it's pretty critical if you see an animal acting abnormally out in the field. If you see elk spinning in circles or drooling or unable to rise, too weak to stand, or just acting just abnormally and unwilling to engage in feeding behaviors and other behaviors, definitely let the manager of the land you're on know. So if you're in Grand Teton, let Grand Teton know. If you're on the National Elk Refuge, let the National Elk Refuge know. The only way we can know if these animals have the disease is to test for it and then obviously remove them off the range so they can't spread it to other animals. So definitely something to keep in mind. Great question. Let's see here. All right. Oh, Joan asks, and I'm assuming you mean moose here. Do the moose have ivory teeth like the elk? Okay, so who watching this knew that elk have ivory teeth? Okay, the short answer is, let's just go ahead and answer the question first. No, moose do not have ivory teeth like elk. But let's go back to elk have ivory teeth, because that's really, really cool. If you want to win a bet, like a bar bet, see if you can't get people to name animals that live in the Western Hemisphere or animals that live in the United States that have ivory tusks. And the scientific name of elk is Cervus elephas. Now, I get really excited about scientific names in Latin, and I try to spare you guys on this program because not everybody is as big of a nerd as I am about this stuff. But in fact, cervus just means deer, and then elephas, of course, would be elephant. So the Latin translation in English would be elk is elephant deer. Pretty cool. By the way, the native Shoshone people called elk wapiti, which is just Shoshone for white butt. So that's another really great name as well. But elephant deer, so named because they prehistorically had protruding ivory tusks. So if you were to come out and see the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem maybe 10,500 years ago, these elk would have had these tusks sticking out. Today, those have receded back into, look very similar to molars, but of course they're not made from bone like teeth typically are. They are made from ivory, and people do make jewelry out of elk ivory. In fact, one of the reasons our elk herd was threatened in the 1930s was people came out here and hunted elk just for the ivory, and those elk ivories were quite valuable. So there's your randomness of the day. Elk prehistorically have tusks that have receded back into teeth. They are the only ones. Moose do not have ivory molars. But great question. Thank you for asking. All right, I think I got them all, guys. Been such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us this week for our monthly roundup. I hope everybody has a great January. We will see you the first Wednesday of February with all of the answers to all your questions, the latest wildlife videos. It's been such a pleasure, everybody. So long.